You're nothing but a burden, and now you're finally getting what you deserve." My hands shook uncontrollably. Those words came from my own son's mouth as the lawyer read my husband's will. Luke inherited our $2.8 million Victorian mansion and $400,000 in investments. And me? After 45 years of marriage, I got a dusty old warehouse on the wrong side of town. "Maybe you can live there, Mom," Luke laughed cruelly in front of everyone. "It's probably more than a useless burden like you deserves anyway." I sat there, humiliated and broken, clutching rusty keys to what looked like the most worthless building in Millbrook, Ohio. My son was already making plans to sell his father's prized Mustangs and renovate his mansion while I figured out how to survive on Social Security. But what Luke didn't know, what nobody in that room could have imagined, was that inside that forgotten warehouse sat 7 restored luxury cars worth $7. $9 million. Cars my husband had secretly collected and hidden, along with a letter explaining why he'd planned this exact moment. Over the next year, I would watch Luke destroy himself through his own greed while I quietly became owner of over $12 million in assets. By the end of this story, my son would be washing cars for a living while I reclaimed everything he thought was his. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while you listen to my story. Are you having your morning coffee, folding laundry, or maybe taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to hear this. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because no woman should ever feel alone in her struggles. I'm Helen Moore, and I'm 67 years old, sitting here in my kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over when Arthur died. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But I had no idea that my husband's final gift would be the chance to discover who I really was underneath all those years of being taken for granted. To understand how we got to that terrible day in the lawyer's office, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back when Millbrook, Ohio, was a different place, and when my Luke was a different person entirely. I met Arthur Moore in 1976 when I was just 22 years old. I was working as a secretary at Millbrook Manufacturing, the plant that employed half our town back then. Arthur was 25, fresh out of trade school, with the strongest hands I'd ever seen and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He was working as a mechanic at Johnson's Garage on State Street, but he had bigger dreams. "I'm going to own my own business someday, Helen," he told me on our third date as we shared a chocolate milkshake at Murphy's Diner. "And I'm going to build something that lasts." We married in 1978 in a simple ceremony at First Baptist Church. Nothing fancy. My dress cost $50 from Sears, and we had our reception in the church basement with ham sandwiches and my grandmother's pound cake. But Arthur looked at me that day like I was the most beautiful woman in the world, and I felt it in my bones that this man would move mountains for me. The early years were hard, like they are for most young couples starting out. Arthur worked long hours at the garage while slowly building his own auto repair business in the evenings and weekends. I kept working at the manufacturing plant until Luke was born in 1981. We lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house on Oak Street that cost us $320 a month, a stretch on our budget back then, but we made it work with love and determination. Luke was such a beautiful baby. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the biggest blue eyes you ever saw. For the first few years, he was everything Arthur and I had dreamed of. He'd toddle around the garage while Arthur worked on cars, pretending to help with his little toy tools. I have a picture somewhere of 3-year-old Luke fixing a carburetor with a plastic screwdriver while Arthur patiently showed him what each part did. "He's going to be a smart one," Arthur would say, watching Luke figure out puzzles that seemed too advanced for his age. "Maybe he'll go to college, make something even bigger of himself than his old man." By the mid-1980s, Arthur's business was thriving. Moore's Auto Repair had become the most trusted shop in Millbrook. People would drive from 3 towns over because they knew Arthur's work was honest and reliable. We saved every penny we could, and in 1987, we bought the beautiful Victorian house on Elm Street for $89,000. It felt like a palace compared to our little starter home. I remember the day we moved in. Luke was 6 years old, running through those big empty rooms, his footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. Arthur swept me up in his arms right there in the front hallway and spun me around like we were newlyweds again. "We made it, Helen," he whispered in my ear. "Our boy's going to grow up in a real home." The house was everything we'd ever dreamed of. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a formal dining room, and a kitchen big enough for the whole family to gather around the table. Arthur spent months refinishing the original crown molding and restoring the stained glass windows. Every weekend was a new project, and Luke would help by handing his dad tools and asking a million questions. Those were the golden years. Arthur's business continued to grow, and by the early 1990s, he'd expanded to include a small used car lot. He had a gift for finding classic cars that other people saw as junk and bringing them back to life. Some he'd restore and sell, but others, the really special ones, he'd keep. "These cars are pieces of history, Helen," he'd explain, running his hand along the hood of a 1965 Mustang he'd just bought for $200. "Someday they'll be worth something, but more than that, they're beautiful. They represent American craftsmanship when people still took pride in their work." I loved watching him work on those cars, the concentration on his face, the gentle way he'd handle each part like it was precious. Arthur had this philosophy that everything deserved to be treated with respect, whether it was a person, a car, or even the tools in his garage. But somewhere along the way, Luke started changing. Maybe it was when he turned 13 and suddenly became embarrassed by his father's grease-stained hands. Maybe it was when he started high school and realized that some of his classmates' families had more money than we did. Or maybe it was just something that was always inside him, waiting to come out. Luke began to show disrespect in small ways at first, rolling his eyes when Arthur tried to teach him about cars, complaining about having to help with yard work, making snide comments about our old-fashioned furniture when his friends came over. "The boy's just going through a phase," I'd tell Arthur when he looked hurt by Luke's attitude. "All teenagers act up. He'll grow out of it." But Arthur saw something I couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. "Helen, I'm worried about Luke's character," he told me one evening in 1998. Luke was 17 then, a senior in high school. "He seems to think the world owes him something just for existing." That's not how I raised him. I defended our son the way mothers do. I made excuses for his behavior, blamed it on peer pressure and teenage hormones. When Luke got in trouble for cheating on a test, I said it was a misunderstanding. When he was caught drinking at a party, I said he was just experimenting like all kids do. Arthur tried a different approach. He offered Luke a job at the garage during his senior year, hoping that honest work would teach him some values. "I'm not getting my hands dirty like some common laborer," Luke said with disgust. "I'm going to college to make something of myself, not waste my life fixing other people's junk." The words cut Arthur deep. I could see it in his face, though he tried to hide it from me. His life's work, providing for his family through skilled labor and honest service, had just been dismissed as worthless by his own son. Luke did go to college, to Ohio State University, where we paid $8,000 a year in tuition and living expenses. But instead of studying business or engineering, like he'd claimed he wanted to do, he spent 4 years partying and barely scraping by with C's and D's. He changed his major 3 times and graduated with a degree in communications that he never used. After college, Luke drifted from job to job. He'd work in sales for a few months, then quit because the manager didn't appreciate his talents. He'd try restaurant work, then leave because it was beneath him. Meanwhile, he was living in our basement, eating our food, and treating our home like a hotel. Arthur's patience was wearing thin. "He's 25 years old, Helen. When I was 25, I'd been supporting myself for 7 years and was already married to you. He just needs time to find himself," I'd argue, though even I was starting to doubt my own words. The breaking point came during Luke's 27th birthday dinner in 2008. Arthur had worked extra hours all week to pay for Luke's credit card bills, again. We'd made his favorite meal, bought him presents we couldn't really afford, and gathered around our dining room table to celebrate. Instead of gratitude, Luke complained about everything. The gift wasn't expensive enough. The cake wasn't the right flavor. The house was too old and embarrassing when he brought girlfriends over. Then he said something that I'll never forget, and neither would Arthur. "When are you two finally going to retire so I can inherit this place? I've got plans for it, you know. This old Victorian could be worth serious money if it was fixed up right. And Dad's car collection is just sitting there, gathering dust, when it could be making real money." Arthur set down his fork very carefully and looked at our son for a long moment. "Luke, this house and everything in it will be yours someday. But inheritance isn't about what you can get from your parents. It's about what they choose to give you. And right now, I'm not sure you've earned the right to anything." Luke laughed. That same cruel laugh I would hear years later in the lawyer's office. "Earned? I'm your son. I shouldn't have to earn what's already mine by right." That night, after Luke had stormed off to meet his friends at some bar, Arthur sat at our kitchen table, this very same table where I'm talking to you now, and said something that didn't make sense to me at the time. "Helen, I need to make sure you're protected. No matter what happens to me, no matter what Luke turns into, I need to know that you'll never be dependent on anyone's charity." I thought he was just upset about the argument. I made him some coffee and rubbed his shoulders and told him not to worry so much about our son. But Arthur was already making plans that would take years to complete, and that would remain secret until the day I needed them most. The signs were all there, but like so many mothers, I chose to see what I wanted to see instead of what was really happening. Over the next 15 years, Luke's sense of entitlement grew like a cancer, spreading through every aspect of his relationship with us and poisoning what should have been the best years of our family life. Arthur's auto repair business continued to thrive through the 2000s and into the 2010s. He'd built a reputation that stretched across 3 counties, and people trusted him completely. But more than that, Arthur had developed an eye for classic cars that bordered on genius. While other people saw rust and dents, he saw potential. While others saw worthless junk, he saw future treasures. I remember one Saturday morning in 2009 when Arthur came home practically glowing with excitement. He'd bought what looked like a piece of scrap metal at an estate sale, some old car that had been sitting in a barn for 30 years. "Helen, you're not going to believe what I found," he said, his eyes bright with the same enthusiasm I'd fallen in love with 30 years earlier. "It's a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT. The owner didn't even know what it was. I got it for $1,200. $1,200 was still a lot of money for us to spend on what looked like junk, but I'd learned to trust Arthur's instincts over the years. He spent the next 8 months restoring that car, working on it every evening after the shop closed and every weekend. He ordered parts from specialty dealers, researched the original specifications, and brought that Ferrari back to life with a patience and care that was almost religious. When it was finished, it was absolutely beautiful. Deep red paint that gleamed like a jewel, chrome that reflected your face perfectly, and an engine that purged like a contented cat. Arthur would start it up sometimes just to listen to the sound, and neighbors would come over to admire his work. "Dad's turned into quite the collector," Luke said one day, but there was something in his voice that should have warned me. Not pride or admiration, calculation. By 2012, Arthur had acquired and restored 7 classic cars. Each one was a masterpiece, and word of his collection had spread throughout the classic car community. People would offer to buy them, sometimes for shocking amounts of money, but Arthur always declined. "These aren't investments, Helen," he'd tell me. "They're art. They're history. You don't sell art just because someone offers you money for it." But Luke saw dollar signs every time he looked at those cars. He'd researched their values online and would casually mention to his friends that his father owned millions of dollars worth of classic cars. It made him feel important, like he was already rich by association. The first major red flag came in 2014 when Luke asked Arthur for a loan to start his own business. He was 33 years old and had never held a steady job for more than 8 months. But he was convinced he could make it as a day trader if he just had enough startup capital. "I need $50,000, Luke announced at Sunday dinner, as casually as if he were asking for the salt. "The stock market is where the real money is, and I've been studying the patterns. I can turn 50,000 into $500,000 within 2 years. Arthur nearly choked on his pot roast. "Luke, $50,000 is more money than most people make in a year. Where do you think I would get that kind of cash?" "Sell one of your cars," Luke said, shrugging. "That Ferrari alone is probably worth more than that now. You could sell it and still have 6 others to play with." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Arthur's face go through several emotions, hurt, anger, disappointment, before settling into something cold and distant. "Son, those cars represent years of my life and work. They're not poker chips for you to gamble with." Luke's response was to launch into a 20-minute lecture about how Arthur was thinking small and wasting opportunities, how the cars were just sitting there depreciating when they could be working for the family, how Arthur's old-fashioned attitude about money was holding everyone back. Arthur listened to every word without interrupting, then quietly excused himself from the table. I found him later in the garage, sitting on his work stool and staring at the Ferrari with such sadness in his eyes that it broke my heart. "He doesn't see the beauty in anything, Helen. He doesn't understand that some things have value beyond money." That was the beginning of what I now recognize as Arthur's secret plan. Over the next few years, he began making subtle changes to our financial arrangements. He told me he was organizing our affairs to make things easier when we got older. He set up new accounts, transferred ownership of various assets, and spent hours with lawyers and accountants working on documents I didn't pay much attention to. "It's just estate planning, honey," he'd say when I asked about all the paperwork. "Making sure everything is legal and proper for when we're gone." Meanwhile, Luke's behavior continued to deteriorate. He'd moved out of our basement in 2013, but only because he'd found a girlfriend, a woman named Jessica who was clearly with him because she thought he came from money. Luke had convinced her that he was going to inherit millions, and she treated me and Arthur like we were her future employees. "When Luke gets his inheritance, we're planning to completely renovate this house," Jessica announced during one particularly uncomfortable Christmas dinner in 2015. "Open concept is so much more modern than all these little rooms. And we'll definitely need to update the kitchen. This whole farmhouse style is so outdated." I felt Arthur's hand tighten on his fork, but he didn't say anything. He'd learned by then that confronting Luke directly only led to bigger arguments. The relationship with Jessica didn't last. She moved on when she realized Luke's inheritance wasn't coming as quickly as she'd hoped. But she was quickly replaced by other women who were attracted to what they thought was Luke's future wealth. Luke seemed to enjoy stringing them along with promises about his family's money, and he definitely enjoyed the way they treated him like he was already rich. By 2017, Luke had started making comments about how we were getting older and should be thinking about downsizing. He'd drive by the house and notice things that needed repair, then suggest that it might be time to sell before the problems got expensive. "You two are rattling around in this big old house," he'd say. "You could sell it, buy something smaller and cheaper, and have plenty of money left over to enjoy your retirement." What he really meant was, "Sell the house so I can get my hands on the money now instead of waiting for you to die." The car comments got more frequent too. Luke would research values online and casually mention that classic car prices were at an all-time high, and it might be smart to cash in while the market was hot. He even brought potential buyers around without asking, introducing them to Arthur as investors who might be interested in the collection. Arthur was polite but firm with these people. "The cars aren't for sale," he'd say simply, and that was the end of the discussion. But I could see the wheels turning in Luke's head, trying to figure out another angle of approach. The final straw came in early 2020, just before the pandemic changed everything. Luke had lost another job, something about personality conflicts with management, and was facing eviction from his apartment. Instead of asking for help, he announced that he was moving back in with us temporarily while he got back on his feet. Arthur was 67 years old, and had been looking forward to our quiet retirement years. The last thing he wanted was to have our adult son disrupting our peace again. But I convinced him to let Luke stay, promising it would only be for a few months. Those few months turned into 3 years of hell. Luke treated our house like a hotel and us like his personal servants. He'd sleep until noon, leave dirty dishes everywhere, bring friends over for loud parties without asking permission, and generally act like he owned the place. When Arthur tried to establish some ground rules, Luke would throw a tantrum like a teenager. "This is my house, too," he'd shout. "I'm going to inherit it anyway, so why shouldn't I live here now?" The stress was killing Arthur. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, the way he'd sit in his chair after dinner looking defeated and exhausted. He'd started spending more and more time in the garage, working on his cars, or just sitting among them like they were old friends who understood him. One evening in the summer of 2022, I found him in the garage at almost midnight, just sitting in the driver's seat of the Ferrari with his eyes closed. "Arthur, what are you doing out here? It's so late." He opened his eyes and looked at me with such love and sadness that it took my breath away. "I'm thinking, Helen. I'm thinking about how to protect you from what's coming." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I should have. Arthur's health had been declining for months. Little things at first, getting winded easily, occasional chest pains that he dismissed as indigestion, trouble sleeping. I kept nagging him to see the doctor, but he'd wave me off. "I'm fine, Helen. Just getting old like everybody else?" But he wasn't fine, and deep down, he knew it. He was running out of time to put his plan into action, and Luke was getting more demanding and entitled by the day. The breaking point came on New Year's Eve 2022. Luke had thrown a party without asking permission, and one of his drunk friends had backed into Arthur's 1969 Dodge Charger, putting a dent in the rear quarter panel. When Arthur discovered the damage the next morning, he was angrier than I'd ever seen him. "Luke!" he shouted. "Get out here right now!" Our son stumbled out of the house, still hung over from the night before, and barely glanced at the damage. "It's just a dent, Dad. Get it fixed and send me the bill." "Send you the bill? With what money? You don't have a job, you don't pay rent, and you certainly don't have money for car repairs." Luke laughed, that cruel laugh that was becoming his trademark. "Come on, Dad. You've got plenty of money. And besides, it's not like these cars are going anywhere. When you die, they'll be mine anyway. So what's the difference if I put a little wear and tear on them now?" I watched the color drain from Arthur's face. In that moment, I think he finally accepted what he'd been afraid to admit for years. Our son was not the person we'd raised him to be. He was selfish, entitled, and completely without respect for anyone or anything. That night, Arthur called his lawyer. Within 2 weeks, he'd made significant changes to his will. Changes that he didn't discuss with me, changes that would remain secret until the day we'd need them most. On Valentine's Day 2023, Arthur suffered a massive heart attack while working in the garage. He was trying to start the Ferrari, maybe for one last time, when his heart simply gave out. The paramedics said he died almost instantly, with his hand still on the key. Luke's reaction to his father's death was to immediately start asking about the will. I needed Luke more than ever in those first days after Arthur's funeral. The grief was overwhelming, and I was lost without the man who'd been my partner for 45 years. But instead of comforting his mother, Luke was making phone calls to lawyers and researching probate procedures. "When do we find out what Dad left us?" he asked 3 days after the funeral, while I was still crying into Arthur's favorite coffee mug. I should have known then what was coming. I should have prepared myself for the humiliation that awaited me in that lawyer's office. But I still believed, somewhere deep in my mother's heart, that my son would do the right thing when it mattered most. I was wrong about Luke, but I was wrong about Arthur too, in the most beautiful way possible. The day of the will reading was April 15th, 2023, exactly 2 months after Arthur's death. Mr. Benjamin Crawford had been Arthur's lawyer for over 20 years, and I'd always liked his gentle manner and honest face. But that morning, sitting in his office on Main Street, He looked uncomfortable in a way that should have warned me something was wrong. Luke arrived 10 minutes late, which was typical for him. He breezed in wearing a suit I'd never seen before, probably bought with money he didn't have, and greeted Mr. Crawford like they were old friends closing a business deal. "Sorry I'm late, Ben," he said, settling into the chair next to mine without even looking at me. Traffic was murder. So, let's get this show on the road, shall we? Mrs. Henderson from next door was there as a witness, along with Mr. Crawford's secretary, Miss Patricia, who had known our family for years. Both women kept glancing at me with expressions that seemed almost pitying, though I didn't understand why at the time. Mr. Crawford cleared his throat and opened a manila folder that seemed unusually thick. "Before we begin," he said carefully, "I want you both to know that Arthur spent considerable time on these arrangements. He was very specific about his wishes and very clear about his reasoning." Luke rubbed his hands together like a child about to unwrap Christmas presents. "Dad always was thorough," he said with a grin. "I'm sure everything will be fair and square." Mr. Crawford began reading in his formal lawyer voice, starting with the standard legal language about Arthur being of sound mind and body when the will was prepared. Then he got to the specifics. "To my beloved son, Luke Arthur Moore, I leave the family home at 1247 Elm Street, Millbrook, Ohio, along with all furnishings and fixtures therein." Luke's grin widened. "Our beautiful Victorian house, worth $2.8 million according to the most recent appraisal, was his. I also leave to Luke my investment portfolio currently held at Millbrook Savings and Trust, with a current value of approximately $400,000. $400,000. Luke was practically bouncing in his seat. Additionally, I leave to Luke my 3 restored Ford Mustangs, the 1965 convertible, the 1967 Fastback, and the 1969 Mach 1, along with all tools, equipment, and supplies in the garage at the family home. Those 3 Mustangs were worth about $180,000 combined, cars that Luke had watched Arthur restore with loving care over the years. Cars that represented thousands of hours of meticulous work and genuine passion. Luke was nodding with satisfaction, already calculating his total inheritance. Close to $3.4 million, not counting personal property and household goods. Then Mr. Crawford looked at me. "To my beloved wife, Helen Marie Moore, who has been my partner and companion for 45 years. I held my breath, waiting to hear what Arthur had left for me. A portion of the investments, perhaps. Maybe the right to live in the house for as long as I wanted. Something that would ensure I could maintain my dignity and independence. I leave the warehouse property located at 847 Industrial Boulevard, Millbrook, Ohio, along with all contents therein." The silence that followed was deafening. A warehouse, an old, run-down warehouse on the wrong side of town that I'd driven past 1,000 times without ever really noticing. A building that looked abandoned from the outside, surrounded by weeds and chain-link fence. I felt like I'd been slapped. Is that all?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Mr." Crawford's expression was unreadable. "That comprises the entirety of the specific bequests, yes." Luke started laughing, not a chuckle or a snort, but full-blown, doubled-over laughter that echoed off the walls of that quiet office. "A warehouse!" he gasped, between fits of laughter. "Dad left you a warehouse. Oh, that's rich. That's absolutely perfect." I felt hot tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I was determined not to cry in front of everyone. Not in front of Luke, who was clearly enjoying my humiliation. "Luke, please," I said quietly. "Show some respect." "Respect?" He wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Mom, you got a warehouse. A useless, empty, worthless warehouse while I got the house, the money, and the cars. I think Dad finally figured out who actually contributed to this family and who was just along for the ride." Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly. Miss Patricia was staring at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing this cruelty. Mr. Crawford's jaw was tight with disapproval, but Luke wasn't finished. "You know what, Mom? Maybe this is actually perfect. You always said you wanted to be independent, right? Well, now you can be. You can live in your warehouse and be as independent as you want. Just don't come crying to me when you realize what you've lost." He stood up, straightening his borrowed suit jacket with theatrical smugness. "Ben, when can I take possession of the house? I've got some changes I want to make, and I'd like to get started as soon as possible." Mr. Crawford's voice was ice cold. "The will needs to go through probate, Luke. Nothing changes hands immediately." "But I can start planning, right? Maybe get some contractors out to look at modernizing the place." I wanted to disappear. I wanted to sink through the floor of that office and never face anyone in Millbrook again. The man who was supposed to love and protect me had just treated me like garbage in front of witnesses, and there was nothing I could do about it. Mr. Crawford handed me a sealed envelope along with the keys to the warehouse. "Helen, Arthur asked me to give you this personally. He said you should read it when you're alone." Luke glanced at the envelope dismissively. "Probably just an apology for leaving you so little. Dad always was sentimental." As we walked out of that office, Luke was already on his phone, calling someone about his inheritance. I heard him say, "It worked out even better than I expected. She got nothing but an old warehouse." Mrs. Henderson walked me to my car, Arthur's old pickup truck that I'd been driving since he died. "Helen, honey," she said gently, "I knew Arthur for 30 years. That man loved you more than life itself. Don't you give up hope just yet." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I was grateful for her kindness. At least someone in this world still treated me with basic human decency. I drove home in a daze, past the house that would soon belong to Luke, past the life I thought I'd be living for the rest of my years. Luke's car was already in the driveway, and I could hear him inside, talking loudly on the phone about his plans for renovation. I couldn't face going inside and listening to him celebrate my humiliation, so I just kept driving. Before I knew it, I was pulling up in front of 847 Industrial Boulevard, staring at the warehouse that was apparently my entire inheritance from 45 years of marriage. It was even worse than I'd imagined. The building was old, probably from the 1940s or 1950s, with faded brick walls and windows so dirty you couldn't see through them. The metal roll-up door was rust-stained and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and somebody had spray-painted graffiti on the side wall. This was what Arthur thought I was worth. This was his final statement about our marriage and my place in his life. I sat in the truck for almost an hour, crying harder than I'd cried since the day he died. Everything I'd believed about my husband, my marriage, my life, it was all a lie. Arthur had seen me the same way Luke did, as dead weight, as someone who'd contributed nothing of value to the family. Finally, I opened the envelope Mr. Crawford had given me, hoping for some explanation that would make sense of this betrayal. The envelope contained two things: a handwritten letter in Arthur's familiar script, and a second, smaller envelope marked, "Open this first, my darling Helen." Inside the smaller envelope was a single key and a note. The padlock on the side door. "Trust me, sweetheart. This is not what it seems." My hands were shaking as I got out of the truck and walked around to the side of the building. There was indeed a door there, secured with a heavy padlock that looked much newer than the rest of the building. The key fit perfectly. The door creaked open, and I fumbled around in the darkness until I found a light switch. What I saw when those fluorescent lights flickered to life changed everything. The warehouse wasn't empty. It wasn't full of junk. It was full of cars, 7 of the most beautiful automobiles I'd ever seen, each one perfectly restored and gleaming under the harsh lights. Cars that made Arthur's Mustangs look like toys in comparison. I walked closer, hardly believing what I was seeing. There was a deep red Ferrari that looked like it belonged in a museum, a sleek silver car with curves like sculpture, a bright yellow sports car that seemed to glow under the lights. Each vehicle was positioned with care, surrounded by pristine concrete floors and clean walls. Against the far wall was a small office area with a desk, filing cabinets, and a comfortable chair. On the desk was Arthur's larger letter, along with neat stacks of documentation. I sank into the chair and opened his letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Helen," it began in his careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just endured what was probably the worst day of your life. I'm so sorry, my love, but it had to be this way." The letter was 4 pages long, written in Arthur's voice as clearly as if he were sitting next to me in that quiet warehouse office. "Helen, for the past 5 years, I've been watching our son turn into someone I don't recognize. I've seen the way he looks at our home, our possessions, our life together, not with love or appreciation, but with greed and entitlement. I've heard him talk about his inheritance like it's money he's already earned, rather than something his parents built through decades of hard work and sacrifice. More than that, I've seen the way he treats you. The disrespect, the casual cruelty, the assumption that you've contributed nothing to our family's success. It breaks my heart, Helen, because I know the truth. I know that every good thing I ever accomplished was possible because I had you beside me. You were the one who encouraged me to start my own business when I was too scared to take the risk. You were the one who managed our finances so carefully that we could buy our first house. You were the one who raised our son with love and patience while I was working long hours to build something for our family. You were the one who believed in me when I spent our savings on cars that other people called worthless junk. I realized that if I died and left everything to both of you equally, Luke would find a way to take control of your portion. He would pressure you, manipulate you, or simply wait for you to die so he could have it all. And if I left everything to you, he would make your life miserable until you gave in to his demands. So I came up with a different plan. A plan that would protect you and teach our son a lesson he desperately needs to learn. Helen, the cars in this warehouse are worth more than everything I left to Luke combined. The red Ferrari alone is valued at $4.2 million. The silver Bugatti beside it is worth $1.8 million. I've spent the past 10 years acquiring and restoring these vehicles, working on them in secret in a rented garage across town. The documentation in the filing cabinet shows that every single car is legally owned by you, has been insured in your name, and has been kept in immaculate condition. But more than their monetary value, these cars represent my love for you. Each one was chosen and restored with you in mind. The yellow Plymouth, that's the same model as the car I was working on the day we met. The blue Corvette matches the color of your eyes. The black Shelby Cobra is sleek and powerful and beautiful, just like the woman I married. I know you're probably overwhelmed right now, my darling. I know you're probably angry at me for putting you through the humiliation in the lawyer's office. But I needed Luke to show his true character in front of witnesses. I needed him to reveal exactly who he's become, so that when the truth comes out, nobody will have any doubt about why I made these choices. You are not a victim, Helen. You are not the helpless widow that Luke thinks you are. You are a strong, intelligent, capable woman who has earned every bit of security and comfort these cars can provide. Sell them if you want to. Keep them if they bring you joy. The choice is entirely yours, and Luke has no claim on any of it. There's more, my love. In the filing cabinet, you'll find documentation showing that I've been quietly buying up Luke's debts for the past 2 years. His credit cards, his car loan, his gambling debts, I've been paying them off and transferring the obligations to my own accounts. Luke doesn't know it yet, but he owes me, now you, over $87,000. You'll also find the deed to this warehouse property, which is worth $340,000 according to the most recent appraisal. The building may look rough from the outside, but it's structurally sound and sits on prime industrial real estate that's been appreciating steadily. Finally, and most importantly, you'll find a life insurance policy that Luke knows nothing about. A policy I took out 3 years ago that pays $500,000 directly to you, outside of probate, with no strings attached. Helen, you're not poor, you're not dependent, you're not at anyone's mercy. You are a millionaire several times over, and every penny of it is yours alone. I'm sorry I had to deceive you about this plan. I'm sorry I had to let you think, even for a moment, that I didn't value your contribution to our life together. But I knew that if you were aware of what I'd arranged, You would never have let Luke humiliate himself the way he did in that office. You would have tried to protect him from the consequences of his own character, the way you've been doing for 20 years. Our son needs to learn that respect is earned, not inherited. He needs to understand that treating people cruelly has real consequences, and he needs to discover whether there's anything left of the sweet little boy who used to help me fix carburetors with his toy tools. I don't know what Luke's reaction will be when he finds out about your real inheritance. I hope he'll be ashamed of how he treated you. I hope he'll realize what he's lost through his own arrogance and greed. But if he doesn't, if he continues to be the cruel, entitled man he's become, then at least you'll have the resources to live your life without ever having to depend on his kindness again. You deserved better than the son we raised, Helen. But you also deserve better than the life of quiet desperation I saw you accepting. You deserve to hold your head high. You deserve to be treated with respect. You deserve to know your own worth. The cars are just metal and chrome, my darling. The real treasure I'm leaving you is your freedom. All my love, forever and always. Arthur P.S. The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in the corner, that one's not for sale. I restored it to the exact specifications of the car I drove on our first date. Keep it, Helen. Take it for drives and remember how it felt to be young and in love and full of possibilities. I read that letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Then I walked around the warehouse again, really looking at each car, reading the documentation Arthur had left, understanding the magnitude of what he'd given me. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a declaration of love. It was vindication. It was proof that the man I'd married saw me exactly the way I'd always hoped he did. If you've ever felt forgotten or undervalued by the people who should cherish you most, I want you to hit that like button right now. If you've ever been made to feel like you contributed nothing to your family's success, leave me a comment sharing your story. And please subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because every woman deserves to know she's treasured, even when the world tries to tell her otherwise. I spent 2 hours in that warehouse, sitting in each car, imagining Arthur working on them in secret, planning this moment. The Ferrari purred when I turned the key. The Corvette's leather seats still smelled like the day they'd been installed. The Bel Air's radio was tuned to the oldies station Arthur and I used to listen to together. But more than the cars themselves, I was overwhelmed by what they represented. Arthur hadn't just given me financial security. He'd given me the power to rewrite the story of my life. I wasn't the discarded wife who'd been left with nothing. I was the cherished partner who'd been entrusted with a treasure. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, I locked up the warehouse and drove home in Arthur's old pickup truck for what I knew would be one of the last times. Luke's car was gone from the driveway, probably off celebrating his good fortune with his worthless friends. I walked into the house that would soon be his, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at our kitchen table planning my new life. A life where I would never again accept being treated as less than I was worth. Luke had no idea that his cruel laughter in the lawyer's office had just sealed his own fate. He had no idea that his dead father had planned for this moment and had given me everything I needed to turn the tables completely. But he was about to find out. The first thing I did the next morning was call an appraiser who specialized in classic automobiles. Arthur's documentation was thorough, but I wanted independent verification of what I'd inherited. When Robert Sterling from Sterling Classic Car Appraisals arrived at the warehouse and saw what was inside, his jaw literally dropped. "Mrs. Moore, where did these cars come from? This collection is museum quality." Over the next 3 hours, Mr. Sterling examined each vehicle with the careful attention of a jeweler studying precious stones. He took photographs, checked VIN numbers, reviewed Arthur's restoration documentation, and made notes on a tablet that seemed to never stop calculating figures. "Mrs. Moore," he said finally, "your husband was a master craftsman. These aren't just restored cars, they're works of art. The total appraised value of this collection is $7.9 million. $7.9 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having in my entire life. But more than the money, I was struck by Mr. Sterling's obvious respect for Arthur's work. Your husband had an incredible eye for finding diamonds in the rough, and his restoration work is flawless, better than some of the high-end shops that charge 6 figures for this kind of project. After Mr. Sterling left, I sat in the warehouse office and made a list of everything I needed to do. First, I called my own lawyer, not Mr. Crawford, who had represented Arthur's interests, but Sarah Morrison, a sharp woman about my age who had a reputation for standing up to bullies. Sarah, I need to understand my rights and options, and I need to make sure that what's mine stays mine, no matter what my son tries to do. Sarah came to the warehouse that same afternoon. When she saw the cars and reviewed Arthur's documentation, she smiled for the first time since I'd known her. Helen, your husband was very clever. Every car is titled in your name individually. The warehouse deed is in your name. The life insurance policy names you as the sole beneficiary. Luke has no legal claim to any of this property, and there's nothing he can do to change that. But Sarah also warned me about what might come next. When Luke finds out about this inheritance, he's going to be furious. People like your son, people who feel entitled to things they haven't earned, they don't accept defeat gracefully. He'll probably try to challenge the will, claim your husband was mentally incompetent, or argue that you somehow coerced him. None of it will work legally, but it could be unpleasant for you personally. I thought about Arthur's letter and his hope that Luke might learn from this experience. But I also remembered the cruel laughter in the lawyer's office, and I realized that my son had made his choice. He'd chosen to treat his own mother with contempt, and now he was going to live with the consequences. Sarah, I want to be prepared for whatever he tries to do, and I want to make sure I have some leverage of my own. That's when Sarah explained about the debts Arthur had mentioned in his letter. Luke owed me $87,000 in various obligations that Arthur had quietly assumed over the years. Credit card debt, a car loan, money he'd borrowed for his various failed business ventures, and gambling debts that Arthur had paid to keep Luke from getting in serious trouble. These are legitimate debts, Helen. Your son signed promissory notes for every penny. If he tries to make trouble for you, you can demand immediate repayment. And if he can't pay, which he almost certainly can't, you can take him to court. Over the next week, I quietly put my affairs in order. I moved the most valuable cars to a secure storage facility. I opened new bank accounts that Luke knew nothing about. I had the life insurance payment deposited into an account at a different bank entirely. And I started making plans for what came next. Luke was making plans too, though he didn't know I was aware of them. Mrs. Henderson called to tell me that contractors had been coming by the house, measuring rooms and talking about opening up the floor plan. Luke had also been bragging around town about his inheritance, buying drinks for people at Mulligan's bar and talking about the improvements he was going to make. He's telling everyone that you're going to move into some kind of assisted living place, Mrs. Henderson reported with disgust. Says it's for your own good since you can't take care of yourself anymore. I wasn't surprised. Luke had been angling to get me out of the house for years, and now he thought he had the legal right to make it happen. What Luke didn't know was that his own financial situation was about to collapse entirely. You see, Arthur hadn't just been paying off Luke's existing debts. He'd been enabling Luke's spending habits by covering his obligations whenever they came due. With Arthur gone, Luke's creditors were starting to notice that payments were no longer arriving automatically. Credit card companies were calling. The bank that held his car loan was sending notices, and the private lenders who'd covered his gambling debts were getting impatient. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the will reading. Luke knocked on my door at 8 in the morning, looking disheveled and panicked. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Did Dad have any automatic payments set up for my accounts? My credit cards are saying I'm behind, but I thought Dad was handling those." I looked at my son, this man who had laughed at my pain and called me worthless, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. "Luke, I wouldn't know anything about your financial arrangements with your father. Those were between you and him. But maybe there's some kind of trust or account that's supposed to cover these things? Dad always took care of this stuff. If there was, don't you think the lawyer would have mentioned it?" Luke's face was flushing red with anxiety. "Mom, I'm serious. I'm getting calls from collectors. They're saying I owe thousands of dollars, but Dad was always handling these payments." I shrugged. "Maybe you should get a job and start handling them yourself." The look he gave me was pure hatred. "A job? Mom, I'm inheriting millions of dollars. I don't need a job. I just need to figure out what Dad set up for the transition period. Luke, the house and investments are tied up in probate for at least 6 months. What did you think you were going to live on until then?" I watched the color drain from his face as reality started to sink in. Luke had never supported himself for a single day of his adult life. He'd gone from college to living in our basement to bouncing between jobs that he quit whenever they became inconvenient. He had no savings, no steady income, and no skills that any employer would value. "Mom, you have to help me, just until probate is finished and I can access Dad's accounts." There it was. The same entitled demand he'd been making his entire adult life, just dressed up as a request for temporary assistance. "I'm sorry, Luke, but I can't help you. I'm living on Social Security and the small savings account your father left me access to. I barely have enough to cover my own expenses." It wasn't technically a lie. I was living on Social Security while I decided what to do with my real inheritance. And the savings account Arthur had left in both our names did only contain about $8,000. Luke's panic was turning to anger. "Mom, don't give me that poor mouth routine. You've got that warehouse Dad left you. Sell it and help your own son. Luke, that warehouse probably isn't worth more than the taxes I'll owe on it. And even if it was, why would I sell my only inheritance to pay your debts?" "Because I'm your son," he exploded. "Because family is supposed to help family. Because when I get my inheritance, I'll pay you back 10 times over." I looked at this man who had shown me nothing but cruelty and contempt, and I felt a calmness that surprised me. "Luke, family is supposed to help family. You're absolutely right about that. So where was my family when I needed help in that lawyer's office? Where was my family when I was grieving your father's death? Where was the help when you called me worthless and laughed at my pain?" Luke's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He genuinely seemed shocked that I was bringing up his behavior, as if my feelings didn't matter enough to remember. "Mom, I was just upset about Dad. You know I didn't mean those things." "Actually, Luke, I think you meant every word. And now you're facing the consequences of treating people the way you've treated me." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out a different approach. "Okay, fine. I was a jerk in the lawyer's office. I'm sorry, all right? But you're still my mother, and I need help. Isn't that what mothers do, help their children when they're in trouble?" It was the same manipulation he'd been using on me for 20 years. The fake apology followed by the guilt trip. The assumption that I would always put his needs ahead of my own dignity. But something had changed inside me during those hours in the warehouse, reading Arthur's letter and understanding how completely my husband had loved and valued me. "Luke, I helped my child for 42 years. I fed him, clothed him, housed him, made excuses for him, and enabled his worst behaviors because I thought that's what love looked like. But you're not a child anymore. You're a grown man who needs to learn how to take care of himself. So you're just going to let me lose everything? You haven't lost anything that was actually yours to begin with." Luke stormed out of the house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. But I wasn't shaking anymore. I was calm, centered, and ready for whatever came next. Because Arthur had given me something much more valuable than money. He'd given me the strength to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. He'd given me permission to value myself the way he'd always valued me. And Luke was about to learn that the mother he'd always taken for granted was not the woman he thought she was. The next few months were like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Luke's financial world crumbled exactly as Arthur had predicted it would, and I watched it happen with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction that surprised me. The first creditor to take serious action was the bank that held Luke's car loan. When 3 months of payments went missing, they repossessed his BMW. The flashy sedan he'd been so proud of, the one he'd bought because it looked successful, even though he couldn't actually afford it. I heard about the repossession from Mrs. Henderson, who witnessed the tow truck driver loading the car onto his trailer right there in our driveway. Luke came running out in his underwear, she reported with barely concealed glee. Started screaming at the driver about how there must be some mistake, how his father had been making those payments. The driver just shrugged and drove off with the car. Without transportation, Luke was trapped in the house that wasn't yet legally his, growing more desperate by the day. He'd sold his father's 3 Mustangs within a week of the will reading, cars that Arthur had spent years restoring with love and patience, sold to a dealer for a fraction of their actual value because Luke needed quick cash. The money from those cars, about $140,000, should have been enough to cover Luke's debts and give him time to figure out his life. Instead, he treated it like lottery winnings. He paid the minimum amounts on his various obligations, then used the rest to maintain his lifestyle of expensive restaurants, bar tabs, and online gambling. I knew about the gambling because Sarah Morrison had hired a private investigator to monitor Luke's activities. We needed to document his behavior in case he tried to challenge Arthur's will. And what we discovered was worse than even Arthur had imagined. Luke wasn't just betting on sports games and playing poker with friends. He was deep into online gambling, losing thousands of dollars a night on casino games and cryptocurrency speculation. The money from Arthur's Mustangs disappeared in less than 6 weeks. "Mrs. Moore," the investigator reported, "your son has a serious addiction problem. He's borrowed money from at least 3 different payday loan operations, and he's been asking around about private lenders, the kind of people you don't want to owe money to." Meanwhile, Luke continued to assume that his inheritance would solve all his problems. He'd started bringing real estate agents through the house, discussing renovation plans and market values. He'd contacted financial advisors about managing his upcoming windfall. He'd even put deposits down on a new car and a vacation condo, confident that probate would be finished soon, and he'd have access to millions. What he didn't realize was that probate was taking longer than usual because of complications with the estate that Arthur had specifically designed to protect my interests. You see, Arthur had been very clever about how he structured things. The house and investment accounts that Luke inherited came with liens and obligations that wouldn't be obvious until the final accounting was complete. Arthur had borrowed against those assets over the years to fund various business ventures, including the secret purchase and restoration of my cars. When probate was finally finished, Luke's actual inheritance would be significantly smaller than he expected. But Luke didn't know any of this. All he knew was that his bills were piling up, his creditors were getting aggressive, and his mother was refusing to help him. The breaking point came in October, about 6 months after Arthur's death. Luke received an eviction notice from his landlord. Even though he was living in our family home, he'd somehow managed to get behind on property taxes and utilities. More importantly, some of his private creditors had started making threats that even someone as oblivious as Luke couldn't ignore. He came to me in a panic, begging for help with a desperation I'd never seen from him before. "Mom, I'm in real trouble. There are people looking for me, people who want money I don't have. I need you to help me, just until probate is finished." I was sitting in my living room, the same living room where I'd comforted him through nightmares as a child, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd listened to him practice piano recitals. But the man standing in front of me wasn't the little boy I'd raised. He was a stranger who had shown me nothing but contempt. "Luke, what kind of help are you asking for?" "I need money. A lot of money. Maybe $50,000. $50,000, almost exactly what he'd asked Arthur for years earlier to fund his day trading fantasies. Where would I get $50,000? "The warehouse, Mom. Whatever it's worth, sell it. I'll pay you back double when I get my inheritance." I studied his face, the same blue eyes Arthur had passed down to him, but without any of the kindness or integrity that had made his father beautiful. "Luke, let me make sure I understand. You want me to sell the only thing your father left me so that I can bail you out of debts you created through your own poor choices? It's not like that. It's exactly like that. And the answer is no. Luke's desperation turned to fury in an instant. You selfish bitch! I'm your son, your only child, and you're going to let me get hurt over some stupid warehouse? The language shocked me, but not as much as it should have. This was who Luke really was when his back was against the wall. Cruel, entitled, and willing to say anything to get what he wanted. Luke, I want you to leave my house, right now. Your house? He laughed that same bitter laugh I'd heard in the lawyer's office. This is my house, old woman. Dad left it to me, remember. You're the one who needs to leave. This house isn't yours until probate is finished. Until then, I have the right to live here, and I have the right to decide who's welcome. You're not welcome anymore. What happened next was ugly. Luke screamed at me, called me names that no son should ever use with his mother, and threatened to have me committed for mental incompetence. He accused me of being jealous of his inheritance and trying to sabotage his life out of spite. Through it all, I remained calm. Arthur's letter had given me something Luke couldn't take away, the knowledge that I was valued, that I mattered, that I deserved better than this treatment. When Luke finally exhausted himself with his tantrum, I made him an offer that I'd been thinking about for weeks. Luke, I'll make you a deal. I'll pay off all your debts right now, today, if you sign a document agreeing to give up any claim to your father's estate. The offer stunned him into silence. I'll give you $100,000 cash, I continued. Enough to pay what you owe and start over somewhere else. All you have to do is walk away from the house and the investments and never contact me again. Luke's eyes narrowed. Where would you get $100,000? Does it matter? The question is whether you want to take the deal or keep gambling that probate will solve your problems. I could see him calculating, weighing his desperation against his greed. The smart choice would have been to take the money and run. It was more than enough to start a new life somewhere else, and he had no idea that his actual inheritance was going to be much smaller than he expected. But greed won, the way it always did with Luke. No deal, Mom. I'm not giving up millions for thousands. I'll figure something else out. That was his final mistake. Within a week, Luke's situation went from desperate to catastrophic. His private creditors, the dangerous kind that Arthur had been protecting him from, decided they were tired of waiting. They didn't hurt him, but they made it very clear that his time was running out. Luke finally did what I'd expected him to do all along. He hired his own lawyer and tried to challenge Arthur's will. He claimed that his father had been mentally incompetent when he made his final arrangements. He argued that I had somehow coerced Arthur into changing his estate plans. He even suggested that the warehouse inheritance was proof that Arthur hadn't been thinking clearly. It was exactly what Arthur had predicted, and exactly what Sarah Morrison and I had prepared for. The challenge failed spectacularly. Arthur's medical records showed no signs of mental decline. Multiple witnesses testified that he'd been sharp and clear thinking right up until his death. The lawyer who'd prepared the will confirmed that Arthur had been specific about his wishes and his reasoning. Most damaging to Luke's case was the deposition Sarah took from Mr. Crawford about the will reading itself. Luke's cruel behavior toward me in that office, witnessed by multiple people, perfectly supported Arthur's written explanation for why he'd structured the inheritance the way he had. But the best part, the part that Arthur would have loved, was that Luke's legal challenge triggered a clause in the will that Luke's lawyer hadn't noticed. Any beneficiary who contested the will would forfeit their inheritance entirely. By trying to get more than what Arthur had left him, Luke lost everything. The house, the investments, the remaining personal property, all of it went to me instead, just as Arthur had secretly hoped it would. Luke's reaction to losing his inheritance was everything I'd expected, and worse. He screamed, he threatened, he accused everyone involved of conspiring against him, but in the end, all his rage and entitlement couldn't change the facts. He'd gambled everything on his sense of superiority over his own mother, and he'd lost. But I wasn't done with Luke yet. Arthur's plan had one final element that my son didn't know about, and it was time to put it into action. When the probate court officially awarded Luke's forfeited inheritance to me in December of 2023, I owned assets worth over $11 million. The house, the investments, the warehouse, the cars, the life insurance money, and Luke's outstanding debts to me. All of it was mine, free and clear. But more than the money, I owned something else, the power to choose my own story. Luke had been evicted from our family home by court order. His creditors had finally caught up with him, and he'd been forced to declare bankruptcy. The dangerous private lenders had been paid off by the court-appointed trustee, which meant Luke was safe from physical harm, but he was also completely broke and homeless. I could have left him on the street. After everything he'd put me through, the years of disrespect, the cruel laughter in the lawyer's office, the threats and name-calling when I refused to enable his self-destruction, I would have been justified in washing my hands of him completely. But I kept thinking about Arthur's letter and his hope that our son might learn something from this experience. I thought about the sweet little boy who used to help his daddy fix cars, and I wondered if there was anything left of that child buried somewhere inside the bitter, entitled man Luke had become. So I made him one final offer. I was sitting in Arthur's old office at the warehouse, surrounded by the cars that represented his love for me, when Luke showed up begging for help one last time. He looked terrible, unshaven, unwashed, wearing clothes that had seen better days. His pride was finally broken, and for the first time in years, he looked like the scared little boy I remembered. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I messed up everything. I know I treated you awful, and I know you don't owe me anything. But I got nowhere else to go, and I don't know what to do." I studied his face, looking for some sign of genuine remorse instead of just desperation. What I saw was a man who had finally hit bottom and was maybe, finally, ready to listen. "Luke, I'm going to make you an offer. Not because you deserve it, but because your father loved you and hoped you might still become the man he raised you to be." I gestured around the warehouse, which was now empty except for one car, the 1957 Bel Air that Arthur had told me to keep. "You can live here in the warehouse. I've had the office area converted into a small apartment, bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe." Luke's eyes widened with relief, but I held up my hand to stop him from speaking. "But there are conditions, non-negotiable conditions." I pulled out a folder that Sarah Morrison had prepared for me. "First, you'll pay rent, $300 a month, due on the 1st of every month. Miss a payment and you're out immediately." "Mom, I don't have any money." Which brings me to condition number 2. You're going to get a job. Not a get-rich-quick scheme, not a business opportunity, not anything that involves gambling or shortcuts. A real job where you show up every day, do honest work, and earn honest pay. Luke looked like I'd suggested he fly to the moon. "What kind of job? I don't have any skills that people want to pay for." "That's going to change. There's a car wash on Industrial Boulevard that's been struggling to find reliable help. The owner is a friend of your father's, and he's willing to give you a chance if you're willing to work." The look on Luke's face was priceless. A car wash, manual labor, getting his hands dirty for minimum wage. "Mom, I can't work at a car wash. What would people think?" "People will think you're a man who's finally learning to take care of himself instead of expecting everyone else to do it for you." I leaned forward, looking directly into his eyes. "Luke, this is your last chance. Not just with me, but with life. You can take this opportunity to build some character and learn some self-respect, or you can walk away and figure out how to survive on the streets. But I'm not giving you money anymore. I'm not paying your bills anymore, and I'm not making excuses for you anymore." He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him struggling with his pride. The idea of Luke Moore, the man who was supposed to inherit millions, washing cars for tips, was almost more than his ego could handle. But winter was coming, and the streets of Millbrook were cold. "If I take this deal," he said finally, "how do I know you won't just kick me out when you get tired of dealing with me?" "You don't. Just like I didn't know you wouldn't humiliate me in that lawyer's office after I spent 42 years loving and supporting you. Sometimes in life, Luke, you have to take people at their word and hope for the best." He signed the agreement Sarah had prepared and moved into the warehouse apartment the next week. The first few months were rough. Luke had never worked a physically demanding job, and his attitude made him unpopular with customers and coworkers alike. But slowly, something started to change. Maybe it was the routine of having to get up every morning and show up somewhere, whether he felt like it or not. Maybe it was the humbling experience of depending on tips from people who had less money than he'd once spent on dinner. Maybe it was just the simple satisfaction of seeing a dirty car become clean through his own efforts. Whatever it was, Luke started to grow up. He learned to be polite to customers, even when they were demanding or rude. He learned to work with his hands without complaining about getting dirty. He learned to manage his money, paying his rent on time and saving a little bit each month. Most importantly, he learned to treat me with respect. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when I thought he might quit and disappear. But gradually, the entitled, cruel man who had laughed at my pain was replaced by someone I could recognize as the son I'd raised. One evening in March, almost a year after Arthur's death, Luke knocked on my door, the same door he'd stormed through in anger so many times before. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to apologize. Not because I need something from you, but because I owe you an apology. I treated you terrible for years, and what I said in that lawyer's office was unforgivable. You deserved better from me." It was the first genuine apology I'd ever heard from him. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," he continued, "about how hard he worked and how proud he was of honest work. I used to think I was too good for what he did, but now I understand that he was a better man than I ever gave him credit for." We talked for 2 hours that night. Really talked, maybe for the first time since he was a teenager. Luke told me about how ashamed he felt about his behavior, about how the work at the car wash had taught him things about himself that he'd never known. I told him about the cars and Arthur's letter and how much it had meant to know that my husband valued my contributions to our life together. By summer, Luke had been promoted to assistant manager at the car wash. He'd proven himself to be reliable, hard-working, and surprisingly good with customers. The job that had once seemed like a punishment had become a source of genuine pride. More importantly, Luke had started making amends for the damage he'd caused over the years. He'd written apology letters to family friends he'd been rude to. He'd visited Mr. Crawford to apologize for his behavior during the will reading. He'd even tracked down the dealer who'd bought Arthur's Mustangs and tried to buy them back. Not for investment purposes, but because he'd realized what those cars had meant to his father. One Saturday morning in July, Luke showed up at my door with a proposal that surprised me. "Mom, I've been thinking about the warehouse space. Most of it is just sitting empty while I live in that little apartment. What if we turned part of it into a proper car restoration shop? You've got Dad's tools and equipment from the house, and there's enough space for several cars." I was intrigued but cautious. "Luke, restoration work takes years to learn properly. You can't just decide to become a classic car expert overnight." "I know that, but I could learn. There's an old-timer named Frank Rodriguez who works on classics out of his garage on the south side of town. He knew Dad, and he said he'd be willing to teach me if I was serious about it." For the first time since childhood, I heard genuine passion in Luke's voice when he talked about a goal. "I'm not talking about getting rich quick or anything like that," he continued. "I'm talking about learning a skill that Dad would have been proud of. Maybe someday I could restore cars the way he did, with love and respect and craftsmanship." I thought about Arthur's letter and his hope that Luke might rediscover the sweet boy who used to help fix carburetors with toy tools. "If you're serious about this, Luke, I'll consider it, but you'd have to prove that you can stick with something difficult when it gets frustrating. Learning restoration work isn't like washing cars. It takes patience and dedication and years of practice." Luke nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I want to earn it, not just have it given to me." That conversation led to what became known around Millbrook as Helen's Second Chance Garage. Luke continued working at the car wash during the day, but 3 evenings a week and every Saturday, he studied under Frank Rodriguez, learning the patient art of bringing old cars back to life. It wasn't easy for him. Luke had to overcome decades of expecting instant gratification and quick results. He had to learn that real craftsmanship couldn't be rushed or shortcutted. He had to develop the patience to strip paint for weeks, to wait for special order parts, to redo work that wasn't perfect the first time. But slowly, steadily, he improved. His first project was a rusty 1972 Chevelle that Frank had found in a junkyard. It took Luke 8 months to restore it properly, and when it was finished, it wasn't perfect. But it ran, it looked good, and Luke had earned every bolt and gasket through his own effort. The day he drove that Chevelle out of the warehouse for the first time, I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen since he was a child. Genuine joy and accomplishment that he'd earned himself. As Luke grew into the man I'd always hoped he could become, my own life was transforming as well. With the security of Arthur's inheritance, I was finally free to live according to my own choices instead of other people's expectations. I'd kept 3 of Arthur's cars, the 1957 Bel Air that held such sentimental value, and 2 others that I simply loved driving. The rest I'd sold through specialty auctions, investing the money in a diversified portfolio that would provide income for the rest of my life. I used some of the money to travel, visiting places Arthur and I had always planned to see but never found time for. I took a Mediterranean cruise, spent 2 weeks in Ireland tracing my grandmother's family history, and drove the Pacific Coast Highway in the Bel Air just because I could. But more than the travel and financial security, I treasured the respect I'd earned in Millbrook. People who had once seen me as just Arthur's wife now recognized me as a woman of substance in my own right. When the local historical society needed someone to chair their fundraising campaign, they asked me. When the library board had an opening, I was invited to serve. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed my humiliation in the lawyer's office, became one of my closest friends. "Helen," she told me one afternoon as we shared tea in my kitchen, "you've become the person you were always meant to be. Arthur would be so proud." The house on Elm Street became truly mine for the first time. I redecorated it according to my own tastes, planted a garden that Arthur had never had time for, and filled it with friends who valued my company. The rooms that had once echoed with Luke's complaints and demands now rang with laughter and conversation. But the greatest transformation was in my relationship with my son. The entitled, cruel man who had laughed at my inheritance had been replaced by someone I could genuinely like and respect. Luke still lived in the warehouse apartment, but now he paid his rent proudly and visited me regularly because he wanted to, not because he needed something. On the first anniversary of Arthur's death, Luke and I visited his grave together. We brought flowers and sat on the bench nearby, talking about the man who had loved us both enough to orchestrate the difficult lessons we'd both needed to learn. "Mom," Luke said quietly, "I know I can never make up for how I treated you. But I want you to know that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to find out who I really was underneath all that anger and entitlement." I patted his hand, hands that were now calloused from honest work and stained with the kind of grease that Arthur had worn like badges of honor. "Your father always said that people show you who they are through their actions, not their words. You've shown me through your actions over this past year that you're the man he always hoped you'd become." As we sat there in the peaceful cemetery, I thought about Arthur's letter and his final gift to both of us. He'd given me the security to demand better treatment and the resources to enforce those demands. But he'd also given Luke something precious, the opportunity to learn that self-respect can't be inherited, only earned. The cruel boy who had called me worthless was gone. In his place was a man who understood the value of honest work, the importance of treating people with dignity, and the satisfaction that comes from earning your place in the world through your own efforts. Arthur's plan had worked perfectly. Love, patience, and carefully applied consequences had accomplished what years of enabling and excuses never could have done. Here I am, 2 years after that terrible day in the lawyer's office, sitting in my beautiful kitchen on Elm Street and marveling at how completely my life has changed. The woman who was publicly humiliated and called worthless by her own son has become someone I barely recognize, and I mean that in the best possible way. This morning, like every morning, I had coffee in the same cup Arthur used to drink from, but now it tastes like freedom instead of loneliness. Through my kitchen window, I can see the garden I planted last spring, rows of tomatoes and peppers that Arthur never had time to grow, flowers that bloom just because they're beautiful, not because they serve any practical purpose. That's what my life feels like now, beautiful for its own sake, not because of what I can provide for other people. Luke stopped by yesterday after work at the garage. Yes, he opened his own restoration business in the warehouse, and it's actually doing well. Word has gotten around about his careful, patient work, so different from the get-rich-quick schemes he used to chase. He brought me pictures of a 1968 Camaro he's working on, and his eyes lit up the same way Arthur's used to when he talked about bringing an old car back to life. "Mom, Frank says I'm ready to work on something really special," Luke told me, showing me photos on his phone. "There's a 1963 split-window Corvette that needs a full restoration. The owner's been looking for someone who'll treat it with the respect it deserves." The pride in his voice wasn't about money or status. It was about craftsmanship, about being trusted with something precious, about earning respect through skill and dedication. It was the same pride Arthur had felt when customers drove miles to bring their cars to Moore's Auto Repair, because they knew he'd do the work right. Luke has changed in ways I never thought possible. He pays his bills on time, treats his customers with respect, and has even started dating a lovely woman named Patricia who works as a nurse at Millbrook General. She likes him for who he is now, not for what he might inherit someday. More importantly, he treats me like the valuable person I've always been. When he visits, he asks about my day, my plans, my feelings. He listens to my stories instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He thanks me for the second chance I gave him, but more than that, he's proven through his daily actions that he deserved that chance. Last month, for my 69th birthday, Luke gave me a gift that made me cry happy tears. It was a photo album he'd put together, filled with pictures of Arthur working on cars over the years. Pictures I'd forgotten existed, showing the man I married carefully restoring each vehicle with the same attention he'd given to our marriage and family. But the most precious picture was one Luke had found tucked away in Arthur's workbench, a photo of me from 1979, pregnant with Luke, standing next to Arthur's first successful restoration project. I was glowing with happiness and possibility, and Arthur was looking at me like I hung the moon. "Dad kept this picture in his toolbox for over 40 years, Mom," Luke told me. "Every day when he went to work, he saw you looking at him like that. I finally understand why he wanted to make sure you were taken care of." That photo is framed on my kitchen windowsill now, where I can see it every morning. It reminds me that I was always cherished, even when I couldn't see it, even when Luke's behavior made me doubt my own worth. The cars that revealed Arthur's love are mostly gone now, sold to collectors who will appreciate their beauty and craftsmanship. But I kept the Bel Air, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons, I take it for drives around Millbrook, remembering what it felt like to be young and in love and full of dreams. The warehouse has become something wonderful, half restoration shop, half community gathering place. Luke hosts a monthly classic car show there, bringing together people who appreciate the art of bringing old things back to life. Arthur would love seeing his tools being used with care and respect, seeing his passion passed on to a new generation. My financial situation is more secure than I ever imagined it could be. The investments Arthur left me, combined with the money from the car sales, have made me genuinely wealthy. But more than the money, I value the independence it represents. I'll never again have to depend on someone else's kindness or tolerance. I'll never again have to accept unacceptable treatment because I have nowhere else to go. I've used some of that wealth to help other women in similar situations. Through my church and the local women's shelter, I've quietly assisted women who need resources to leave bad situations or start over after loss. I understand now that financial independence isn't just about money. It's about having choices, having dignity, having the power to demand better. But the most valuable thing Arthur gave me wasn't the cars or the money or even the security. It was permission to value myself the way he'd always valued me. His letter didn't just reveal hidden treasure, it revealed hidden truth about my own worth that I'd somehow forgotten over the years. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be, the woman who accepted scraps of respect, who made excuses for people who treated her poorly, who believed she didn't deserve better, I want you to know something important. You are valuable. You are worthy of respect. You deserve to be treated with kindness and consideration, not because you're useful to someone, but because you're a human being with inherent worth. Maybe you don't have a husband who's secretly planning to reveal your value through a warehouse full of classic cars, but you still have the power to demand better treatment from the people in your life. You still have the right to set boundaries, to say no to disrespect, to refuse to enable other people's bad behavior. It's never too late to start valuing yourself the way you deserve to be valued. If this story of transformation and second chances has touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Each like helps other women find their way to these important truths. Tell me in the comments what gave you the courage to demand better treatment in your own life, or what's holding you back from making changes you know you need to make. And please subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every woman deserves to know that her story matters, her voice has value, and her worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. The warehouse that once seemed like punishment became the foundation for our family's redemption. The son who called me worthless became a man who understands the value of honest work and genuine respect. The inheritance that looked like rejection became proof of the deepest love I've ever known. Arthur's final gift wasn't just financial security. It was the chance for both Luke and me to become the people we were meant to be all along. Luke learned that respect must be earned through character and action. I learned that I deserved respect simply because I existed and had value as a person. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places that look least promising. Sometimes the people who love us most have to let us experience difficult consequences in order for us to grow into our best selves. And sometimes what looks like an ending is really a new beginning in disguise. I'm 70 years old now, and I've learned that it's never too late to rewrite your story. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to discover treasures you didn't know you had. The warehouse changed everything, not because of what was inside it, but because of what it revealed about love, value, and the courage to stand up for yourself. Luke washes cars for a living now, and he's never been happier or more respected. I drive classic cars and live exactly as I choose, and I've never felt more valuable. Arthur is gone, but his love continues to protect and provide for both of us in ways we're still discovering. That, my dear friends, is what real love looks like. Not just words or promises, but actions that endure long after the person is gone. Love that sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself. Love that finds a way to lift you up, even from beyond the grave. If you have that kind of love in your life, cherish it. If you don't have it yet, don't give up. You're worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth treasuring. The warehouse taught me that the most valuable inheritances aren't always the ones that glitter. Sometimes they're the ones that show us who we really are and give us the courage to live accordingly.